Hello, everyone. Welcome to our second lecture in Unit 2 in our series on political science. Um, this lecture is going to be specifically on structural realism, which emerges as a direct response to the school of classical realism. You oftentimes see this theory also called neo-realism, and the two are used interchangeably, and you'll see why in a minute. But think of this not so much as a repudiation of classical realism. Neorealism doesn't go around saying that classical realism is wrong. It's more that it tries to update and refine those ideas to be more applicable to the world after World War II. Now, here's what I mean. So, as we saw, classical realism believes that the world is inherently anarchic. It's a self-help system, very Hobbesian. The actors that sort of operate in this self-help system are exclusively states, so no individuals, no international organizations. They don't really matter. Why we care about states because the only power that realists acknowledge as being important and legitimate is military power. So they understand that for their own survival. And so what realists try to avoid in the classical realm is great power war, the war between major powers. And so you do this by balancing power in a multipolar system. And as I said, Morgenthau writes about classical realism in the immediate aftermath of World War II. But we know what happens after World War II. You don't revert back to a multipolar system. Instead, we get the Cold War. And the Cold War is a world that is not multipolar. We don't think of a large number of equally powerful states in the Cold War. That's not an accurate reflection of what the Cold War was. And so the big thing, the big change that structural realists look at when studying the Cold War is a simple one. That is that the structure of the system, bipolarity, etc., can determine your choices and can force your choices. So here's the example that classical realists point to it as an example of multipolarity. This is the continent of Europe in the years leading up to World War I. You have 5 countries of equal power: England, Germany, Austria, France, and Russia. And in this, Germany and Austria were allied, and France and Russia were allied. Great Britain, however, is a peacemaker, switching sides depending on which side gets more or less powerful in order to maintain the balance. So if Germany or Austria become more powerful, then England will ally with France and Russia in order to maintain balance. But its role as peacekeeper is a constraint of the system. Like, think about this rationally. If I were Great Britain, wouldn't it be far better for me to be on the winning side of a war and reap those benefits, as opposed to constantly shifting back and forth in a balance of power? This is sort of what we talk about when we talk about the structure of the system determining your choices. And in fact, structural realists take this a step forward and talk about hegemony. Hegemony is the big key concept in neo-structural realism. We mean by hegemony the concentration of power in only a few actors in the international system. So for realists, both classical and structural, this means by definition a concentration of military power in one or more states. And in a multipolar system, you have a whole bunch of hegemons. But what we find is that because we're talking about multipolarity, because we're talking about structures of the system, it is ironic, but the distribution of power is what's providing order to the anarchic system. It turns out the world is not as anarchic as we think it is. Countries cannot do anything they want, bound by logical decision making. A lot of times their choices are sort of bound up into what they can or can't do based on the system in which they operate. So Great Britain in our previous example could not do whatever it wanted. As a peacemaker, it had to strike that role. Now there are two main thinkers in neorealism, and the first one is a man named Kenneth Waltz. And Kenneth Waltz writes a lot about bipolarity in his paper, The Stability of a Bipolar World. And so, to make this sort of easier to understand, we're going to use pie charts to understand when we talk about multipolarity. So here is a more graphical visualization of the concept I was describing before. You have 5 powers, each of which has equal amounts of power. So in this scenario, England is neutral, whereas Russia and France are allied, and Germany and Austria are allied. And as I said, its role as peacemaker is structurally constrained. But if the power of, say, Russia and France becomes larger, well, then England will ally with Germany and Austria and maintain the peace. You maintain peace in a multipolar world through the strategic use of alliances. However, in the Cold War, in the world after World War II, multipolarity was no longer the system that existed. Instead, you had a bipolar world. In this case, hegemonic power is only concentrated in 2 major powers, the United States and Soviet Union. Now, the 2 major powers can never confront each other for fear of mutually assured destruction, MAD. If the Soviet Union and the United States engage each other militarily directly and you get a war, that is a war that is unwinnable for either side. And the US and the Soviet Union inevitably will destroy each other. And so you can only really maintain peace. Again, you have to maintain balance, but you do that through the strategic strengthening and disarmament of the 2 major players. So for example, the United States and Soviet Union get together and say, we're going to reduce the number of nukes that we have, or we're going to limit where we test nukes, or vice versa, by building more nukes than the other person. And speaking of nukes, the Cold War brought with it a certain issue, because mutually assured destruction in the Cold War was not just mutual, it was globally assured destruction. And so that becomes crucially important. Now, in a bipolar world, if you can't go to war with each other directly, in order to maintain power, you must instead expand into the rest of the world. Which is why the battles of the Cold War are not fought in the US and the Soviet Union. They're fought here, in Vietnam, in Korea, and Afghanistan. Bipolarity means, by definition, a willingness to quote Kenneth Waltz, a willingness to fight small wars. The US and the Soviet Union cannot go to war with each other directly, and so they go to war with each other indirectly. However, Waltz makes an interesting note. That is that in spite of all of this, in spite of this war and all of the drama that occurs, the US and the Soviet Union never go to war with each other directly. There is no war in the Cold War, at least directly, between the US and the Soviet Union. In fact, Kenneth Waltz says that within a bipolar world, there's actually 4 different factors that encourage a limitation of violence. There's 4 different things that cause violence to never really break out between the major powers. He says, well, with only 2 world powers, there are no peripheries. There's no area of the world that's outside of the realm of the Cold War. If you think about it, think back to history, we fought the communists indirectly all over the world, from sub-Saharan Africa to South America to all sorts of places. Now we can debate whether that was effective or not, but what we cannot argue is that there was this sort of global nature to the Cold War. And any event in the world that involves the fortunes of the Soviet Union or the United States automatically elicits the interest of the other. Any possibility of maintaining a general peace, as I said, requires a willingness to fight small wars. But not only are there no peripheries in the bipolar world, the range of factors included in the competition is extended as the intensity of the competition increases. Essentially, because in a bipolar world, the actions of your rival is obvious, and what you will benefit your rival is obvious, you need to compete with that rival everywhere. But that doesn't always necessarily mean militarily. So, for example, this is Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space. He was sent into space in what was the equivalent of a hollowed-out nuclear weapon. What the Soviet Union was saying when they sent Mr. Gagarin into space was not that they could put a man on the moon, is that they could put, a man into space, but rather that they could put nukes in space. But yet this is the start of the space race. And in fact, this is also true with the economy. Waltz says, when it became increasingly clear that the Soviet economy was growing at a rate that far exceeded our own, many began to worry that falling behind in the economic race would lead to our losing the Cold War. And so the U.S. doubled down on the economy, and it worked. And so you compete not only everywhere, but on everything. Third, that you have bipolar balance. But in bipolar balance, you have the nearly constant presence of pressure and the recurrence of a crisis. So every couple of years during the Cold War, there was a crisis of some kind. The Berlin crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Afghanistan crisis, the Vietnam crisis, the Korea crisis, all of these crises, the Congo crisis, all of these crises are endemic to bipolarity because the existence of this competition between the two major powers leads to a presence of pressure. And so the first three combine to produce an intense competition in a wide arena with a great variety of means employed. The constancy of effort of the two major players, combined with a fourth factor, their preponderant power, have made for a remarkable ability to comprehend and absorb within the bipolar balance the revolutionary, political, military, and economic changes that have occurred. And so here are the four factors. The first is that there is no area of the world immune to the effects of bipolarity. Each and every country in the system follows the logic of the system. And by the way, this is something that we have carried over from the Cold War. We still call countries that were affiliated with the United States the First World, countries that were affiliated with the Soviet Union the Second World, and countries in the developing world where this Cold War was fought the Third World. That's where those names come from. The second factor is that bipolar hegemonic powers compete over every aspect of reality. It's not just military power. So in a bipolar world, you have competition over economic or cultural dominance, because these things, according to Waltz, can quickly translate into military dominance. The third, that the bipolar world creates tensions, pressures, and crises that force both hegemons to get involved, regardless of their national interests. So, for example, we enter Vietnam not because it is in our interest to be in Vietnam, but because we are scared that Vietnam will fall to the communists. That is why we get involved in Vietnam. And the opposite is also true for Afghanistan. The Soviets get involved in Afghanistan because they are afraid that Afghanistan will fall to the United States and her interests. And of course, the fourth factor is that because both hegemons are eminently powerful, that conflict will change in light of the development of new political, economic, and military changes. Now, all of this is well and good, but the Cold War ended. We no longer live in a bipolar world. Instead, the other predominant neo-realist, William Wohlforth, argues that we now live in an age of unipolarity, in which the power distribution looks like this. In fact, he says, in this article, I advance 3 propositions that undermine the emerging conventional wisdom that the distribution of power is unstable and conflict-prone. He says, unipolarity is a structure in which one state's capabilities are too great to be counterbalanced. In this case, the United States, her capabilities are too great to be counterbalanced. And once capabilities become so concentrated, a structure arises that is distinct from either multipolarity or bipolarity. The world will not revert back, in Wohlforth's mind, to multipolarity or bipolarity. But at the same time, let it be noted that the capabilities that the United States has are not so great that they're going to produce a global empire. Unipolarity should not be confused with, say, a multi- or bipolar system containing one especially strong state, nor should it be confused with an imperial system with only one power. There are several powers, but the United States is chief among them. Unipolarity essentially means that there is one dominant but not universal power. And so here are the 3 propositions that Wohlforth puts forward on unipolarity. The first, simple. Unipolarity exists. It's a thing. Because after the fall of the USSR, no global power rose up to take its place. And so the system is unipolar, and the United States is the only remaining unipolar hegemonic power. Unipolarity, however, Wohlforth argues, favors the absence of war amongst the great powers and comparatively low levels of competition for prestige and security, for 2 reasons. The first, the leading state's power advantage removes the power of hegemonic rivalry from world politics and reduces the salience of stakes of balance of power politics amongst major states. Basically, in a unipolar world, there is no rival to the hegemon. And so this removes conflict by definition. If there is no rival, no one can challenge the hegemon. That is a source of potential conflict removed. But importantly, in a unipolar world, collaborating with a hegemon is advantageous, and opposing it is dangerous. There are certain advantages that countries get by playing ball with the United States. Not just economically, but militarily, right? So for example, this is the most heavily militarized border in the world. This is the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. The North does not get along with the United States, and the South does. And the South has benefited immensely from their collaboration with the United States, not just economically, but militarily, which is, if you have friends serving right now, or you are about to serve yourself, you can attest to this. Chances are you're going to be stationed in Korea, because that is where we set up. So I was saying, the reason why you have soldiers stationed in Korea is because the South Korea plays ball with the United States. South Korea benefits from the United States because they collaborate with us. The North does not, and we can see the effects that has had on the North. And so, the first proposition, as we said, unipolarity exists. The second proposition is that unipolarity is peaceful, because it removes the sources of conflict that existed in both bi- and multipolarity, but also because states see it as in their interest to collaborate with the hegemon. Countries that oppose the hegemon, on the other hand, don't last very long. Or if they do, they're tremendously impoverished. There is no real benefit to isolation in a unipolar world. And so, unipolarity, as Wohlforth says, rests on 2 pillars. The sheer size and comprehensiveness of the power gap separating the United States from the other states, and the U.S.'s position as an offshore power determines the nature and likely longevity of unipolarity. See, what Wohlforth is saying is not only is unipolarity in theory good for all of these reasons, but this unipolarity in particular, with the United States on top, is going to be particularly beneficial because the United States has both a military advantage and a geographic advantage, securing its position as a hegemon. Geographic, well, it's offshore. Other countries have borders to deal with. The United States' borders are Canada, a friendly country, Mexico, a friendly country, and fish. And so they never have to worry about being invaded. They never have to worry about a large-scale land invasion from any of its neighbors. That is not a luxury that other countries in our position have had. But this is not to say that there are not challenges to hegemonic power. So the first one is going to be counterbalancing by other states. Other states don't like the United States being on top, and so they all join together in one mega alliance. The second is regional integration, and the third is differential growth and power. So let's tackle these one by one. Wohlforth argues alliances are not structural. Because alliances are far less effective than states in producing and deploying power internationally, there is a distinction between the distribution of capabilities among states and alliances states may form. A unipolar system is one in which a counterbalance is impossible. When a counterbalance becomes possible, the system is no longer unipolar. So here's the example that he gives. In this case, I have collected here the United States as the hegemon and graphically showing a collection of several major powers that are somewhat hostile to the United States: Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. In this graph, you would notice that they all have similar levels of military power. In fact, they have exactly the same. But Wohlforth argues that even though their relative strengths are exactly the same, a single state is more capable of using its military power than an alliance of several powers with equal strength. So if hegemon and coalition, in this case, go to war with each other, well, then the hegemon would still win because it's a single country and not an alliance. It structurally has an advantage over the coalition. Now, here's scenario 2. So I've added a fifth country to the coalition, and now the U.S. is at a disadvantage. However, Wohlforth would argue, the U.S. is an offshore power. It's much, much more secure than any other country. So, for example, a coalition in this case is only really effective against the land power. It's very difficult for Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and India to invade the United States. That would be very difficult for them to do, if not impossible. In fact, he notes that the counter-coalitions of the past formed against centrally located land powers, France, Germany, the Soviet Union, that constituted unambiguous security threats to their neighbors. Coordinating a counterbalance against an offshore power that has already achieved unipolar status is that much more difficult. Think about it. Getting all of these countries to not only work together, but also get together enough ships, enough airplanes to invade an offshore power. They can't just walk to the United States. That's not an option. And so it's all that much more difficult. And so to bring an end to unipolarity, it is not enough for regional powers to coordinate their policies in traditional alliances. They must, and this leads to that second point, translate their aggregate economic potential into concrete capabilities necessary to be a pole, a defense industry, and a power projection capabilities that can play in the same league as those of the United States. Essentially, what is being said here is that the countries need to merge together. Think a European Union on steroids, combining not just their economic potential, but creating a shared defense industry and power projection. that can play in the same league in that of the United States. Essentially, becoming a coalition isn't enough. So in order to challenge the hegemon, you need to sort of integrate into a single country. But here's a question. Why? Why would you give up your sovereignty, your independence, to challenge the hegemon when collaborating with the hegemon is just that much more beneficial? Like if I'm, I don't know, Greece. I'm a middling country in Europe, but I'm part of the European Union, and I get along very well with the United States. What would be the point of me joining together with the European Union, creating a country called the United States of Europe that can challenge the United States? What would be the point? Why would I give up my independence and challenge the United States, the hegemon, when collaborating with the hegemon is just that much more beneficial? Now, Walforth notes, it is possible that the United States will decline suddenly and dramatically while some other great power rises. Think giant meteor strikes Washington, D.C. But this is extremely unlikely. It's far more difficult for a country to gain hegemonic status than it is for a country to lose it. And so, here are the three propositions. First, unipolarity exists. Second, unipolarity is peaceful. And third, unipolarity is durable. Understand these three things, you can understand unipolarity. So I wanted to give you a quick recap on realism, both classical and structural, so you can really get it. You have three theorists of realism: Morgenthau, Waltz, and Walforth. For Morgenthau, the world system is completely anarchic, Hobbes' state of nature. For Walforth and for Waltz, it's anarchic, but there are hegemonic structures that exist that provide some semblance of order to the world system. For classical realists, a state's behavior is defined entirely by their self-interest. For a structural realist, it is structurally defined. Morgenthau prefers a multipolar system, Waltz prefers a bipolar system, and Walforth prefers a unipolar system. So I hope that made sense. If you have any questions, leave them in the discussion section. Shoot me an email. You know how to reach me. And that's all. See you in the next one. Bye-bye.